A new report blames former Attorney General Jeff Sessions for the separation of thousands of migrant families at the U.S. Mexico border. The Justice Department's internal watchdog found that Sessions and his office were the, quote, driving force behind the zero-tolerance policy, and that they weren't prepared to deal with the fallout from those family separations.
CBS News immigration reporter Camilo Montoya-Galvez is here to break down this report and the calls for immigration reform once the Biden administration takes office. Camilo, good to see you, my friend. So what are the main takeaways from this report?
Well, good morning, Anne-Marie and Vlad. This is arguably the most comprehensive internal government report into the Trump administration's unprecedented policy of systematically separating migrant children from their parents along the U.S. Mexico border. The report by the Justice Department's Inspector General contradicts statements made by former Attorney General Jeff Sessions and other top administration officials who argued that it was never their intention to separate families, that all they wanted to do was to prosecute the parents for crossing the border illegally. But this report makes it clear that these officials, including Sessions, knew, Anne-Marie and Vlad, that parents and their children would be separated as a result of this zero-tolerance prosecution policy. For context for our viewers, what happened was that children were incorrectly designated as unaccompanied minors and sent to shelters overseen by the U.S. Refugee Agency, while their parents were prosecuted for the misdemeanor offense of crossing the border without legal permission. And then they were sent to ICE detention centers, and there was never a plan to reunite them. Despite all these warnings, the report says that Sessions and his closest advisors at the Justice Department were a major driving force in implementing this policy, and that they overruled concerns by U.S. attorneys along the U.S. Mexico border who were prosecuting these cases. Some of these U.S. attorneys had concerns about prosecuting parents of children who are younger than 5, and they also were worried that the prosecution of these families would have an impact on their ability to prosecute other criminal cases, more serious criminal cases, including those related to sex crimes.
Yeah, you know, one of the more damning sort of elements of this report talks about several U.S. attorneys who recall Jeff Sessions talking about taking away children and not giving kids or people traveling with those children amnesty. And it makes it very, very clear that they were aware of the fact that they did not have the systems in place, the structure, to deal with the fallout of separating small children from their parents. Jeff Sessions, and frankly, there didn't seem to be much concern about what would happen to these children. Jeff Sessions was not interviewed for this report. He's not in office anymore. Why did he refuse to be interviewed?
Well, we don't know specifically why Jeff Sessions was not inclined to be interviewed for this report. We do know that the Justice Department's Inspector General does not have the power to force former employees of the department to participate in interviews in its investigations. But what we do know is that when Jeff Sessions ran for an Alabama Senate seat last year, he touted his role and implemented this zero-tolerance policy. He did not call it a family separation policy, but rather portrayed it as a policy designed to deter border crossings and to give consequences to adults who cross the border without legal permission. So he has touted this policy, and there have only been a handful of top administration officials who have expressed sincere regret over the implementation of this policy. One of them is former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, who sent us a statement yesterday for the first time expressing regret over his role in implementing this policy, saying that him and other department officials should have done better.
So, Camilo, how many families are still separated, and what's holding up the efforts to reunite them?
Sure. So during the spring of 2018, when the zero-tolerance policy had been implemented across the U.S. Mexico border, more than 2,800 families were separated. Most were reunited because they were still in the U.S. when a federal court ordered the administration to stop this practice and to reunite them. Some were deported without their children, but most were able to reunite with them in their home countries, most of them in Central America. However, In 2019, the U.S. government revealed that it had separated more than 1,500 additional families before implementing the zero tolerance policy across the entire border in 2018. Advocates are still trying to search for 600 separated parents who have yet to be located and who could be eligible to be reunited with their children. However, the Trump administration opposes reuniting these families here in the U.S. It wants them to reunite in their home countries. And so advocates are calling on the incoming Biden administration to allow these families to reunite here and to have access to medical resources as well as a pathway to U.S. citizenship as a form to rectify the legacy of this policy.
So the ACLU is calling for the incoming Biden administration to implement some major immigration reform. More than 100 lawmakers led by the Congressional Hispanic Caucus also sent the Biden team a letter calling for change. Here's the thing about immigration reform. Certainly immigration has been confounding and a challenge for every administration. But when it comes to immigration reform, there is bipartisan support for it. How, in what way it should be implemented, there may be challenges, but everyone across the board, agrees that this immigration system needs an overhaul. What does the ACLU, what do some of these lawmakers want to see the next administration do?
Well, one area where advocates and progressives want the incoming Biden administration to focus on is executive power on immigration, which, as you know, President Trump used pretty frequently during his 4 years in office to reshape the asylum system, for example, to expand ICE detention, to limit legal immigration and work visas, and to institute a number of restrictions across the entire U.S. immigration system. Advocates want Biden to do the same and to use the same power, rather, to undo many of these changes and to create policies that are more progressive leaning and welcoming of immigrants. But of course, many of these changes will require congressional action, like placing DACA recipients on a pathway to U.S. citizenship. This is a proposal that has bipartisan support, but has failed to pass in Congress multiple times. So it will be important for us to keep tabs on whether the now Democratic-controlled Senate and House will be able to pass a DREAM Act bill when Biden is inaugurated in a couple of days. But it's still, I think, too early to tell whether there's going to be enough support in Congress, bipartisan support that is, to pass a comprehensive immigration bill that addresses all the different aspects of the system here, like farm workers, dreamers, the other 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country, the asylum system at the U.S. Mexico border. So there are a lot of interests at play here.
And I'm so glad that you're on this beat, Camilo, because, it's one thing for reporters and journalists to focus on an administration that implements a policy like this. And now we all know that the Trump administration implemented some of these policies. But more importantly, as people begin to perceive that the president-elect is going to run a different kind of administration, these things can sometimes fall through the cracks because people aren't focusing on the shock of seeing children in cages or seeing children separated from their families, and then we move on to other things. And I think it's going to be even more important to have reporters like you staying on this beat, holding the Biden administration accountable so that they just can't say, well, that's something that happened in the last administration, that they continue to work on fixing it. And that's why your work is vitally important, so we appreciate it.
Thank you, Vlad.